You feel no, I feel better when I watch tomorrow. Yeah, on Wednesday. So I'm trying
Hello, good evening. I think we can start. Welcome to this event of Studium Generale. My name is Annelies Noordhoff. I'm a program maker of Studium Generale. Studium Generale is a platform for the university and the Hanse. We organize all kinds of programs. You can see them behind me. And of course, you can also find them on our website. Please take a look, and you do not have to miss anything. And everybody is welcome. Tonight we are going to listen to Helga de Valk about children on the move. This lecture is the fourth lecture in the series about migration. What does science tell us about migration? And the last lecture of this series is on May 13 with Henk van Houten, who will give a talk about his book, Freedom Map. And we will also organize an after talk, so please take a look on our website for the info and the tickets. But first, our lecture of tonight. Helga de Valk will tell us more about the effects of migration on children, and more specific, the relationship of migration and well-being in adulthood. How does moving as a child impact the health, the well-being and family formation of both migrants and natives later in life? Helga de Valk is director of NIDI, the Demographic Institute of the Netherlands, in the Netherlands, and professor of migration and the life course at the University of Groningen. And her research focuses on migration and integration issues, immigrant youth, and family formation. Please welcome Helga de Valk.
Well, thanks. I hope this works. It doesn't? Is it okay now, or yeah? Okay. Well, thanks a lot for that nice introduction. I'm very happy to be here tonight, and I would like to present some of my work that I'm doing as a researcher, because I am a professor at the Faculty of Spatial Sciences, and as mentioned, I'm the director of NIDI in The Hague, but I'm also a researcher. And what I present tonight, and I want to make that very explicit, is it doesn't work to get my... what I want to tell tonight is not only my research, but it's research that's done with a large group of people, as is most often in research. So I really would like to also acknowledge all the collaborators there, because the work I'm presenting here is part of a larger European Research Council grant that I have, in which about 10 to 15 people collaborate with me to research. So it's really a group science, and I think it's important to acknowledge that, and I will mention all the names later on. The title is Children on the Move, and it's in the program of migration. And I think it's interesting to reflect on what we mean by migration, because when I teach and when I ask my students, what do you refer to when you refer to migration, the first thing people most often say is asylum seekers. The second thing is Turkish and Moroccans in the Netherlands. But actually, all that is not necessarily what I'm talking about tonight, because worldwide, we see that the largest group of people don't move across borders, but within the country. And that is not only the case in the Netherlands or in Europe, that's the case on all continents across the world and for decades in a row. Because if you look at the share of international migrants as part of the total population of the world, it's about 2.5% to 3% of all people. But there's many more people that are actually moving. So when you look at the share of people that move within their lifetime, within the country they live in, it's much larger. So you see that it really goes up until like 2/3 of people that are moving. And the second thing, when we think about migrants, we most often think about adults. So we really think about those adults who are coming, who are on purpose, make the decision to move, or who are forced to move, given the circumstances they are in. And we very often neglect that it's a large share of children who are actually experiencing the move. So it's their parents who decided to move, but they are part of that move. And in the project, we try to shed light on both these elements, internal mobility, as we call it, to make it distinct from international migration. And we focus on children in particular and how they experience this moving. And when you Google this, you see a lot of kind of alarming messages on the web. Like moving with children, parents should not think light about this, or moving is tough for kids. So it suggests that moving is something bad to experience in your childhood. So it suggests that this mobility is not something good. It's something that you probably try to avoid as adults, parents. Question is this really the case? And if it is not good for children, is this only not good in the short run, or is it also having long-term effects? And when I suggested this research project to the EU, we said, well, we actually don't know that much. We have no knowledge about it. Where it's an important life event that a lot of kids are experiencing, and I'll show you some data on that later on. But we don't know what actually is the result of the moving for these children or their families. So on the one hand, indeed, moving, probably all of you have experienced once in your lifetime a move. Most of us remember it was not just relaxed. Very often you're kind of at some point like, oh my God, all these boxes I have to pack or unpack. I have to settle in, feel at home. So it is a life event, as we call it in sociology, that can be particularly stressful. It's also for children potentially disruptive in their development, because children go through these stages of development, and when you experience this at some point in your childhood, it might impact you as a child, but potentially also in the longer run, the way you are formed and your formation psychologically. And it's also a disruption of your social network, trying to find new friends, building up a new network, not only for the child, but also for the family and the embeddedness of the family. On the other hand, some literature that's out there, and the literature that is there is mainly coming from the US so far, says it can also be positive. And in the US context, this means, for example, for children who are at very early ages already involved in crime activity. So they are having some kind of negative environment where they, if they are taken away from that environment, actually do improve. So they're no longer part of a gang or not part of a neighborhood that's not having a positive impact on them. And it can, in that sense, disrupt these negative friendship ties. But actually, all of this is based on a few studies, mainly in the US, and we hardly know anything for Europe, let alone for the Netherlands. So that's what we try to do in this study. And we try to look at different children that are coming from different backgrounds, with different families, and who move for quite diverse reasons. And we not only look at the fact whether they move or not, but we look much more in detail the reason for the move and the timing of the move, as well as the distance. You can imagine that the timing of the move is quite important. So when you're 2 years old, probably moving is not going to bother you at all. Probably your parents are stressed, so that might affect a little bit the parenting styles, but in the long run, it might be relatively limited. Well, you can imagine that when you're 16 and you're moving, that might be very different. Also, the reason why parents are moving to another place might be important. If your parents get divorced, this can have a potential negative effect because there's conflict potentially in the family, combined with moving to another place, different homes, potentially 2 different homes, which might be very different than when your parents are moving because they get a better job, with better payment, in a better neighborhood. So that's what we look at. We look at the distance also that people move. So do they move close by, or do they go to the other side of the country? So are they moving in the Netherlands from The Hague to Groningen, or are they moving within Groningen to a different neighborhood? All these factors, you can imagine, could potentially affect, but we have not studied them before. So we look at the neighborhoods, we look at the characteristics of the family, so we also look at whether parents are highly educated or not, and the characteristics of the child. And we on purpose also include very different children. So we include those who were already from the country of origin where they currently live, so who are having a non-migrant origin, as we refer to them, and those who came at some point in their life to the Netherlands already, because they moved internationally. And for these children, you could argue they probably already are very resilient because they have experienced an international move. So, well, this small step within Groningen will not harm them that much. Or they probably are very vulnerable. So an additional step might actually impact them even more. And I don't know whether you've seen or followed the news. I'm not sure how many of you are Dutch-speaking. There was some news, it was in the news again, I think it was yesterday or this morning, because I had a long day, so probably it was this morning. It feels like yesterday. But I think it was this morning in the car when I heard this news about the impact that's going to be researched of the children of refugees who are asylum seekers in the Netherlands and who are moving houses many times, and the impact that might have on these children. So there are concerns with the governmental agencies that this might impact them negatively, something which has been already signaled by UNICEF about 15 years ago. So it's about time that we know a bit more about this. So in the project, we distinguish between these children and those who have not experienced an international move in their life before. And we want to know whether it has a different impact. What is the experience later in life? And we distinguish not only those who come for refugee reasons, but also because the majority of people are actually not moving because they're seeking asylum. In the total volume of mobility of international migration, that's only a relatively small share. The large majority of people who are moving to the Netherlands or to Europe are people who come here to work, or because they find their partner here, or because they come to study here. Probably some of you also moved to the Netherlands because you came to study here. So we distinguish these different types of migrants. And we not only look then at what happens to them in the short run when they are 15 or 18. No, we want to know what happens to them in the longer run, and particularly in their health and well-being and in their demographic behavior. So are they less happy? Are they having more health issues? And on the other hand, are they forming less stable relations themselves? Are they more vulnerable to early pregnancy? And these kind of demographic behaviors we're thinking of. We do so by looking in different countries. Actually, in the end, we have more countries than is colored blue in the map, because Finland has been included in the meantime as well. So we look at 8 different European countries, and tonight I will also present you some of the findings from each of these countries. I start with the Netherlands, but I also give you a little bit of a comparative picture. Is the Netherlands unique, or are we actually more similar than we probably think to other European countries? In my later presentation, even though I just now have only these nice drawings, so it's easy to follow, I will have some tables with data and figures. Don't get scared. If you don't like the tables and figures, you just listen, because I will explain every detail of that table and figure. So don't be afraid that you don't understand what is on there. Because what we do in this study, we try to follow people who are currently adults, and we look at them, what happened in their youth. So we take you at age 25, and we look backwards, like what happened when you were between 0 and 16. And with the Dutch register data, and with many other register data in the Nordic countries, you know exactly where people have lived throughout their life. You know where they lived, you know with whom they lived, you also knew what kind of housing they had, what kind of income they had, what kind of job their parents had. So we use these register data to basically look backwards in people's lives and where they are now. And then in that way, we can establish the link between what happened in your youth and what is the current situation. And we also use some survey data for that. And in the surveys, people are asked questions, and they are then asked retrospectively about their mobility histories in the past. I do acknowledge that this is only a small, well, a more limited way of looking. You can also think of many interesting questions that you could interview people, go more in depth. And one of the things that is on our wish list for a long time, which we probably don't make it in the duration of the project, which will end this year, is that you can think about neighborhood. And for children, neighborhoods might have a very different meaning than for us as adults. And one of the big questions we still have is like, what is for a child a boundary to that neighborhood? Is it crossing the street? Is it 2 blocks away? Or is it just really another marker that really makes that they feel that they have moved far away? Because moving 1 kilometer as an adult is probably very different from moving 1 kilometer as a child, your experiences and your perception. I have to disappoint you. I have not an answer to that one, but I can give you some insights in the other stuff. So first of all, I would like to show you a couple of things about who is actually moving. Is that across the board? How many kids are affected there? And then secondly, a range of studies where we look at the consequences of the move. As I said, this is teamwork, so I really want to acknowledge the different co-authors. That's why I put these pictures in there so that you also know who was there. So this is part of a study what I started with that was conducted by Joeke Kuivenhoven and Marjolein Das, a colleague at Statistics Netherlands. And Joeke is actually going to defend her thesis early summer here in this same building. These are also public events, so in case you're interested, you can always join and have a look what she is actually has been doing in her 4 years PhD work. Well, we started in this paper, which was the kind of the basis of the project, like what kind of patterns of mobility can we now see? What do children move a lot? And if so, who are the ones that move often and the ones that move less? And do we see differences between those of migrant and non-migrant origins? And as presented, we look at those 4 dimensions. So the timing, so the frequency, how many times do you move? Because you can imagine if you just move once in your life, well, that's not going to be a big deal. But if you move really frequently, then that might be much more impactful. So we look at the timing and frequency, we look at the distance, so how far people have moved, and we look at the change in the place where they lived. As I was saying, we use the full population register data, and this is from Statistics Netherlands, CBS, which means that we can include all the children who were born between 1995 and 2003, and we follow the whole history between 0 and 16. We exclude those who are in institutional households, so we just include those who are living with at least one of their parents. And that means that we have 1.6 million children that we can follow between 0 and 16. So this is really large data. What do we see? Well, let's say about a third of children never move throughout their life. So 38% never moves in the whole period between 0 and 16. But that also implies that almost 2/3 actually does move at least once between 0 and 16. It's probably less than you thought, or probably more than you thought. It is quite substantial, so we do see quite some people who are moving, quite some children who are experiencing a move. But when we look then at how many times they move, the majority only moves once. So 58% moves once between 0 and 16. 2 moves, it's about 25%, and then 3 to even 20 moves, 17%. And interestingly enough, this last group, I will say a bit more about that last group later on in my talk, because that last group is a particularly interesting one. I'll come back to that one. We also see that these children are relatively young. So they're, well, we get a mean, so it's a weird age that you get, 4.7 years, but it means basically around the time that in the Netherlands you start primary school. That's the most often age. And the distance is short. Again, if we think about migration in all our daily lives, we always think about long distances, but moving is often short distance, 2,39 kilometers is the mean. Well, if we then look and split it up by migrant origin versus no migrant background, so the top bar is the no migrant background, and you see that the black line is the longest there. 41% of these children never moves. You see that 1 move is about a third, 2 moves 15%, and more than 3 or more moves about 10. And if we compare this to the largest origin groups that we could distinguish with the data, those of Moroccan, Turkish, Surinamese, and Antillean descent, compared to, we classify them as non-Western, other Western. I'm sorry about this distinction, I'm not very happy about, but we had to group them somehow into meaningful ones. This was at that time the classification we used, but I know that we can really think about being more precise about this. But let's look at the 4 groups that we can distinguish. What we do see is that migrant children, irrespective of their origin, all move more often than those of non-migrant origin. So irrespective of background. And we see in particular that for the groups of Surinamese and Antillean, but also the other non-Western, it's much more likely to move at least twice or 3 to many more times. So mobility is higher also for those who already experienced an international move. We come back to that when we talk about the consequences. The moving happens for almost all children at a relatively early age. We have the different origin groups in different colors. You see exactly the same lines, but the level of the lines distinguishes the groups. So the lower level are the non-migrant origin group, the Dutch, who have no migrant background, and then you see that every other group moves more often, but they follow exactly the same line. And you see that it's mainly around the start of primary education up to maximum the start of secondary education that most moves happen. So after 12, it's a relatively small group of children who move. So it seems that parents are mainly thinking about moving when their children go to school, and they are reluctant to take their kids to another place once they are in the school ages. If we look at the geographical distribution, let's look here a little bit at the different provinces, for example. You see that particularly in the area of Flevoland, we see a lot of moving happening, and that has to do with the fact that these are mainly people who move out of Amsterdam to Almere, Lelystad, for example. And we do see that especially in the urban areas, the bigger cities, there's more mobility than in the places around in the more, well, as far as we have rural areas in the Netherlands, the more rural areas. I'm going to skip this because I would like to look a little bit at consequences. I didn't know exactly how much time I had, but I want to give you also a little bit more insight into what are the effects of these moves. So what we've seen so far, childhood internal mobility in the Netherlands is very diverse. There's different types of movers with different potentially implications, and we'll look at those implications in a minute. But it's important to also distinguish between these different dimensions of how many times you move, but also the distance you move, as well as the age at which you move. What we also find, and this is important to bear in mind, children of immigrants move more often. So what we did in a review of the literature done by two other colleagues, Gustav Wachter and Maaike Hoornstra, they looked actually at what do we know from the literature now in terms of the moving of migrants versus non-migrants when it comes to Europe. Because as I said, the literature is mainly on the US, and we wanted to know more what is known on the European case. And they've screened a database of the literature where they included in the end 60 studies for this review that they did. Conclusions that they draw. Also there, we find migrants are more mobile. They're particularly more mobile shortly after arrival. And this suggests that this question that I heard this morning on the radio is really valid to understand better. Does this mean that, for example, it's mainly refugee children who are coming here to apply for asylum that are going through the country because of the policy of resettlement? Or is it the case for everybody shortly after arrival? Because it can also be that once you come to a country, you need to first settle, find a place, you start at an initial place, and then you come to a place where you probably are more permanently going to live. Migrants do move shorter distances than the majority group. So we do see clear differences there. We find exactly the same also in our Dutch study. So they move more often, but they move shorter distances, which also suggests that they not necessarily move out, for example, of bad neighborhoods. They rather probably stay in that same neighborhood. And it's more often in urban areas that they move. So the Netherlands and the findings we had there are confirmed also in Europe. So we're not that different in that sense in comparison. But then what we did with some colleagues in Sweden is focus particularly on those children who are really moving very frequent. And we've called them super movers. It sounds great. I'm not sure whether it's great in the end as a result, but they are really the ones where you can see what the effect might be. Now, what we looked at is what are the factors, what are the characteristics of these children that are moving a lot, in line with the research question that I presented before. And we do see that especially children who are experiencing a divorce are moving very often also in the Swedish case. So those are the kids that are moving a lot. We do see, on the one hand, it's children whose parents have higher education that move often, but we also see that children whose parents are on benefits move more often. And this suggests actually that there is two different groups of movers here, and that you can also see here. So the first two moves are very often to a better neighborhood. And those children who are moving 3 times or more very often go downwards, so they have worse neighborhoods after the move. So what we concluded is that also in Sweden, the majority of children move during adulthood, or during childhood, just like what we found for the Netherlands. But about a quarter are considered super movers. They move more than 3 times. These moves are all relatively short distance, and very often it's union dissolution on the one hand, but it's also socially stratified. And here we come to an important part of the story that can impact children's life. So we see that it's mainly higher educated parents where you have moving relatively frequent and where the distance is slightly longer. And for the group that we call super movers, it's those children that move slightly longer distances during childhood, but very often their parents are in a worse socioeconomic position. They are on lower income, they have worse jobs, and they go to poorer neighborhoods. So these super movers seem to be a particularly vulnerable group that might have long-lasting effects also of the moving as such. And this is an important element because if you think about policies like, is moving bad and should we do something about it or how can we support it? Well, it's important to realize that it's not equal and it's not the same for everybody. I move on. Yeah, sure. Would you like to? I don't know. It's fine with me either way.
It's okay.
I feel fine. It's fine. I just want to make sure we're not starting a whole discussion because then we're probably not ending the whole.
So you want to study the effects of how many moves have an effect on further life.
Yeah.
But I was wondering how you could distinguish the effects of the moves with, for example, the low socioeconomic statures that you have there.
Yeah, I come to that in a second if that's okay with you. Yeah, and if I don't answer the question totally in the presentation, then I come back to your question later on. Finally, just some little historical background. How did we look at childhood in a different way? This is, again, one of my PhD students looking at this, where we look at the respondent. So all these different slices are basically a year in a person's life, and we follow between 0 and 17 how often the person has moved retrospectively. And we compare this for 28 countries in Europe. So we went from the Netherlands to Sweden, to now Europe as a total. And what we see is that mobility in childhood is particularly high in the more northern European countries, which is on the left-hand part of the slide. So Finland, Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden. And you do see that over time, because these are cohorts, so people that were born between 1935 up to those who were born in 1990, you see that there's a peak just after the world wars, where you see that this is really increasing. So people are very mobile. On the right-hand side, on the top, you see Southern Europe, below the Eastern European countries and the Southeastern European countries. Much lower levels of mobility. So we do see that across Europe, there's quite some diversity in the extent to which children are actually experiencing a move. And over time, there's also a change. Whereas flat in Southeastern Europe or in the Southern Europe, we see just a peak for Cyprus, but that's due to small numbers. We do see this curve in the Northern European countries. And this curve, we have related that to basically different elements. On the one hand, after the Second World War, these were the places where there was economic growth. There was also an increase in divorce, and this comes back to your question, like how can you distinguish the reasons and the socioeconomic part of it. And there's also a decrease because potentially people were postponing childbearing. So now I come to the consequences, and I give just 2 examples because I don't want to talk all the time, and I would like also to take the opportunity to discuss some of these findings with you. We started out with a meta-analysis on health outcomes, and a meta-analysis, for those of you who are not familiar with this technique, it's a structured literature review on the one hand, and you also try to compare the different effects that are found in the different studies and compare the effect sizes. So you really try to bring all the data together from these different studies. So you're not just looking at the literature and the outcomes, but really trying to look at the exact effect sizes as well. And we said, well, this mobility might have adverse effects on health. Variation in findings, as I mentioned, on the one hand, can be positive to move out of a bad neighborhood, but it can also have no relation at all. So let's have a look. We wanted to integrate these elements, and we wanted to look at the age of moving here specifically, and parental SES. Does it matter? We had in total 55 studies, again, mainly from the US, a few from Europe, about 11, and we looked at different elements of health. On the one hand, externalizing behavior, also internalizing behavior and suicidal behavior, psychosocial disorders, and physical disorders. Those were the different health outcomes that were studied here. And what do we see? The effect sizes, what it basically says, the 0 means there's no effect size. When you see that the bars go mainly to the right, that means that there are effect sizes. So indeed, mobility does affect health. That's what all these studies, all these 55 studies basically say. So there's a little effect. A positive effect here means that it's affecting your health. So it's not necessarily positive for your health, but it's having an effect on your health. And then we looked indeed, does it matter when you move? When you move in adolescence, only in childhood, or when you have moves both in adolescence and childhood. And what we saw, it's mainly having an effect in adolescence. So moving in adolescence has a negative effect on your health. And when we control for parental socioeconomic status at that time, it basically remains the same. So irrespective of the resources that your parents have, whether they have a good income or a good education, it has a negative effect, but only in adolescence. So it doesn't matter that much for childhood when you are between the ages of 0, 5 to 10, but it does affect between 11 and 20 years of age. Then it has an effect. So this is an important finding because it's just not the same for all children. It does make a difference when you experience it. Was there a question now?
Yeah, I have 2 questions. This data, is this for the Netherlands or?
No, these are 55 studies from across 37 are coming from the US and the remainder is coming from Europe.
Okay, yeah. Because I have a related question. It's namely that the Netherlands is known for making people making their friend circles relatively early in life, at about this age actually. So what effect has that in this context, if any?
Well, what we see, not only in this study, but also in the comparison, so the Netherlands and other Northwestern European countries are pretty similar on that point. So actually we do see that those effects are pretty similar across the board. So the Netherlands is no exception there. It might be an exception when we compare ourselves to Southeastern European countries, and in some cases also with the US, where you see very different patterns of mobility overall, but where you also see very different demographic behavior overall. So there it's really different. But I come back to that in a second, if that's okay, a bit further as well. So we see negative effect, childhood mobility on health. It's stronger when it's in adolescence, and it remains significant also when you include parental socioeconomic status. Final example that I would like to give is the relationship between moving adolescence and life satisfaction. And this one is, this is joint work by one of the other PhD students, Jules Henkens, and supervised by Matthijs Kalmijn and myself. Here we use the survey data from Germany, so these are German data, And again, we see that quite a large share of the children have moved ever in their life, about 20%, close to 20%. Some of them have frequent movers, 4% only, so that's not that big. And we have a distribution with migrants and those of non-migrant origin. Well, what see we see? Life satisfaction. Life satisfaction is an overall measure where people are asked, how satisfied have you been in the current last week with your life? So this is asked to people in adulthood, when they were adults, when they were between the ages of 23 and 26. And then we look back at whether they moved in childhood. And we controlled, and that comes back to your earlier question, we controlled for a whole set of elements that are part of people's lives. So the socioeconomic status of the family, whether they ever experienced a divorce, but also whether they were of migrant, of non-migrant origin. And what we found is that indeed, moving does have an effect on life satisfaction in adulthood, but only when it happened frequently. So moving once in your lifetime is not going to have a long-lasting impact. It can probably have a short-term effect on life satisfaction, but in the long run, it's not going to be detrimental, is what we found. And what we also see is that although those of migrant origin indeed have lower life satisfaction, it mainly relates to those of the second generation. So mainly for those who were born in the country with parents who were not born in the country, those are the ones whose life satisfaction is even more negatively influenced when they are moving in childhood. So these findings are really important to understand what is happening. And I want to come to my final slide with my take-home messages and come back a little bit to your questions, because I do think that it's really interesting to hear what are the questions you have related to this and what I can tell you further. So I'm going to skip this and I come immediately to the take-home messages. So mobility in childhood is very common. It's very common in the Netherlands. It's very common across Northwestern Europe. It's slightly less common in the South European and Southeastern European countries. But the experience of this mobility is very diverse. So the effects on children's life in adulthood is very diverse. And we do see that it's important to go beyond this dichotomy, did you ever move? Because it's much more about how often did you move, what kind of distance, what kind of circumstances that really affects the consequences in later life. So that already tells us something about what are the processes beyond that. We have only looked here in these studies on outcomes. We have school outcomes. I didn't show you that, but I can show you if you're interested. We have looked at health outcomes. We've looked at demographic behavior, but obviously there are many other elements that we could study. And one of the important elements, we did our study during COVID times. This was totally unintentional. I got the grant in 2019. We started, and then in 2020, COVID. Interestingly enough, our topic is about mobility. During COVID time, we actually all experienced immobility. And particularly for children, mobility on the one hand can have negative effects, but immobility could just as well have negative effects, because those parents who probably wanted to divorce, or those who wanted to go to better housing, or those who wanted to move to a different place, were less likely to do so. And in combination with also having less friendship networks that you could see on a daily or regular basis, and since what we found in these studies is that it's particularly hitting adolescents, one could think of that COVID also has a very large impact in this regard. So one of our ambitions is really also to look in the future more into how did the COVID pandemic potentially accentuate even these effects, also for the kids that were immobile, because they were probably kept in a situation that was less good for them than what we would hope for. So with these messages, I would like to wrap up the presentation. I really want to acknowledge the whole team who's working on each of these different elements from their own perspective. And we're trying to really bring the field forward to not just looking at international migration, but combining this literature from international migration, what we know from childhood mobility, to try to understand what is the best way also to inform governments and policy. Because I refer to the Dutch policy where we have asylum seekers who apply for asylum and who then are basically going through the country based on their stage in the asylum procedure. This is very different from what many other countries have. So for example, in Sweden, when you enter the country, you apply for asylum, you basically stay at the place where you file your asylum application. You're not going to a special center, and the kids in that sense also have much more stability. So what we see here is that it looks like this going around has quite some negative effects, and particularly if the children who are accompanying are already in adolescence. And as we have seen, those of international migrant origin also, even in our study, even without having a refugee background, having gone through the asylum procedure. So I think these kind of elements are important also for policymakers to understand what can we do, and also for others who are working with children. How can we mitigate the potential negative effects? What can we do about this in order to make sure that these children will not have these negative effects in the long run? Well, that's going beyond, unfortunately, our grant, but it's something that we definitely want to study and include in the future. And with that, I would like to conclude here, and I'm very happy to take your questions and have a debate about these findings with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Helga, for this lecture. And yeah, talking about this group that is so easily neglected, perhaps. I already see one question here.
Thank you. I actually have two. The first is, you were talking about policy. I think one of the policies in Dutch housing, especially social housing, is that you get a house partly based on the size of your family. Mm-hmm. And there are, I think, cultural differences in the family size. So I would like to hear your views on that. Mm-hmm. The second question is, well, for a long time, your house was also part of social mobility. You moved when you were growing up in life, and well, with the housing market basically collapses. What is your view on the effects on that? Because there are other different takes.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. No, very important. I think one of the most urgent issues in actually the current policy area and policy domain is housing. I mean, I'm the vice chair of the State Committee on Demographic Development in the Netherlands 2050, and also there we pointed out the housing crisis is the most important, and also in regard of this kind of research, actually it is. You are right. What we do see is that when there's a new child born in a family, we do see more mobility. People are searching for larger houses. And the problem, however, is that although indeed in social housing, the house that you get basically decided for you where to live, is based on your family size. But given the housing crisis, that not necessarily means that when there's a new child born, you automatically go to a new house, right? And particularly in the larger cities we're talking about here. So when you think about Amsterdam, Rotterdam, but also Groningen, then it's not automatically that you get assigned a new house when you have an extra newborn in the family, even though probably you want to. And there is an important element, because exactly that is what we also found, is that when people have the freedom to move, they will move to a bigger house. So those who can buy houses, when they have a newborn, we see that they move. So it also means that there is potentially overcrowding in the houses where there's not this option available, because you have a social rented house, where you don't have the opportunity to move further. So these housing conditions and overcrowding is potentially a big issue, which might have, on the one hand, positive effects if you're not moving, but overcrowding might actually be even equally bad or even worse. And that relates again to the COVID pandemic, because what we learned there is that a lot of these children who didn't have the luxury of having a large house and a lot of space to follow classes online or to do their homework, that was even more hard on them because they didn't have what their peers had with larger houses and so on. So I do think it's important to realize this. Your second question relates a bit more to the future of the housing situation. Help me a little bit, what were you tapping into in terms of the policy?
With the collapse of the housing market, there is the issue of, it solves the problem of, well, you're not able to move, so you have a strong local network because you're not going away. But you have also that problem of you don't have the space for yourself to actually get the rest or the concentration that you need. And all those social factors are especially accumulated in lower social... So you have this accumulation effect in certain strata. So you see actually an accentuation of the social inequality that's already there. I'm not sure whether I answered your question with those. Well, I was curious in general what your... so basically it's what do you want to say about this topic?
What do I want to say about this topic? Well, that's a good point. I think there's very different elements. I don't want others not to be able to ask questions, but let's distinguish three different... but it's good, but I explain probably a bit longer. Three different elements there. On the one hand, I think in the Netherlands, the housing crisis, again, it's not typically Dutch as well. It's also happening all across Europe. So also at the EU Commission of Demography and Democracy, what they have identified as the largest issue across European countries is housing crisis. There is a big difference between the cities and other areas in the Netherlands. So the regional difference is really huge, and we saw that also in terms of the mobility of children. So the housing crisis hits hard, particularly in the cities, and hits even harder in the lower socioeconomic strata because there is no option to escape. We've seen that part happening, and also in research clearly. Linking that to my research, you can basically say, indeed, it is those children that are then trapped in the lower socioeconomic strata, in the worst housing, in the worst neighborhood. The solution cannot be that people leave the neighborhood. It basically means we have to do something about the whole housing situation in general. Because otherwise there will always be new kids and others who are filling those worst neighborhoods and houses. Right? So we have to think much more about how do we want to live together, what kind of housing, and how do we achieve that children start with equal opportunities. Because they now don't start with equal opportunities. So you basically already have inequality at a very young age, which basically is accentuated because of different events throughout the life course. So what should be done in policy? Indeed, providing these equal opportunities in the housing. So make sure that people also can realize their housing desires. And that relates to my second point. Try to make sure that the way we think about living together also changes. Because what we now have is that we have people living in eensgezinswoning. Is that a family house?
Sure, let's go with that.
Yeah? Okay, eensgezinswoning for the Dutch-speaking people. The family house, but not necessarily having a family. So we have many more people who are on their own in all phases of the life course, more than ever. So in the past it was just young people, and then you found your partner, you had a family. But now across the life course you have stages of living alone. And our housing market is totally not adapted to that. So we have lots of people who are living alone in a house that they not necessarily want or need. We have all kinds of policies and also legislation that makes it very unattractive to leave those houses. So when I am 60 or 65 and I live together with my partner, then I'm potentially cut on my pension. And I am not eligible for all kinds of benefits. So we have to make also these, we have to think about, at least creatively, also how we want to live together and how we want to start our housing market being more dynamic again and adapted to these different life stages for the different families. Because as we see in this research, it does matter where you live and how you live. And the third element is much more related, and that's again what we see in this study, but also related to the COVID pandemic again. If you have housing situations where you are much more adaptable, where also people care for each other much more within the living arrangements, that can overcome also the potential negative effects of the resources your parents don't have or your house doesn't have. So for those of you who come from Germany, you're all familiar with Mehrfamilienhäuser. That's something we totally don't know in the Netherlands. We always immediately then think that we have to have our parents in our backyard. That not necessarily has to apply. We don't have to have our own parents in our backyard, but there's other ways of living together across generations where this can then also be a resource, particularly also for children and not just for elderly. Because we very often think that's just a resource for elderly who need support. But particularly for children, this can also be a resource. Because they have then also the opportunity to have in their homes people who are also there, to mingle across generations. And I think that's an important element if you want to also tackle these socioeconomic lines as well as intergenerational lines.
Yeah, it takes a village to raise a child.
Voilà. Yeah.
Are there other questions? Yeah. 2, 3.
Before there's a new question answered, I want to also double check, did I answer your question? Because you had a question before, and I'm not sure whether I answered it, so come back to me later on if I didn't.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting. I have a question regarding the decision-making of who decides if you have to move, if you analyze that impact or if you intend to analyze it. For example, you said people are moving because of better job opportunities and it's kind of the free decision of the parents compared to forcibly displaced people who have to go to a different housing project or are in refugee homes and have to move because they're assigned to somewhere else, if you also included that effect on the well-being of children.
Yeah. Thanks for that question. Yeah, that's a very important one. We call that kind of agency. So whether the parents have agency over the decision, and you can imagine that it's very different if you don't have something to say and it just happens to you, versus basically you have the choice and you have, for example, 10 jobs to choose from and you just pick one and you make sure that your whole family is happy and you move to a beautiful house and you have fantastic income. Yet we do see indeed a difference. We do see particularly an accumulation of disadvantage when it has a negative effect. So for those children whose parents indeed have not a lot of say about where they move, so for whom indeed they depend on social housing, or those who are, for example, displaced people coming from international crisis areas who are coming then to the country. So it's mainly this accumulation of different elements of disadvantage that makes that it has a long-lasting negative effect on children. So when the parents have no agency, when they have lower income, when they have lower education, a bad housing situation, so the housing conditions, so the literal housing conditions, not only the perceived ones, but also the ones that are physically visible, different, combined with, for example, divorce and unstable relationship patterns. So where parents lose jobs, so when they're in and out of jobs, when they are in and out of different housing because they have to move on, when there's unstable, so for example, a lone mother who then moves on with a new partner and another one, and moves a lot, for example. So it's really this accumulation of different, when it has a long-lasting effect. And indeed, when you have more choice, it seems, when parents have more choice, it seems that the effects are less negative because they can also compensate and prevent the accumulation, basically.
So you just named basically all the negative circumstances that can lead to negative causes. And I was wondering what the strategy of integration could maybe do for mitigating or moderating these effects, and if you see differences between integration methods and approaches in different European countries towards moderating this effect.
Yeah. Thanks for that question. Yeah, as I referred to, we're currently in the middle of doing that, so I cannot give you the findings yet, for particularly the refugee groups. So we're trying to see the differences between the effects on children in the Netherlands versus those in the Nordic countries. So Denmark and Sweden have a very different policy in the way they receive children, and they do have the same register data as we have, so we can look back to them, because in other countries we simply don't have the data. So it's basically one of the few countries where you can study this. It seems to be that the Dutch policy, where children are really moving along in the asylum procedure, is having worse outcomes. But I cannot have a final say on that yet, because we're in the middle of that. But like I also mentioned, asylum is only a small proportion of where why people come to the country. We didn't look at integration policies as such. We did distinguish between those who come from other European countries versus who came from countries outside of Europe to the Netherlands, for example. And there you do see that, for example, Europeans are not prone to integration programs at all, but they do have a lot of agency, because they can decide themselves whether they come and go, because they don't need any visa or permits to enter or to re-enter. And again, agency is an important element in the whole debate. So we do see what we seem to see also there. I'm a little bit reluctant to make firm conclusions yet. Is that indeed, particularly those groups who have more agency and more capital, so the kenniswerkers, so the highly skilled workers, and those from other European countries, seem to be slightly better off than those who come from other countries, and not necessarily refugee origin countries, because we do have a lot of people also coming from other areas in the world. Yeah. But thanks also for suggesting this integration programs. We should think of that further. So thanks for mentioning it.
Thank you for the lecture, but my question is also about the notion of life satisfaction. Could you please elaborate a bit more on how do you measure it? Because the question to me, I know that maybe it's me personally, but I would answer it differently depending on the time of the day you would ask that. And if you add all of those like cognitive factors, like whether you had your morning coffee or did you sleep enough, but that really would impact the answer in that case. So are there any other indicators? How do you go around that? Thank you.
Thanks for that one. Yeah, it is an interesting way of trying to capture people's state of mind, so to say. Sometimes it's also referred to happiness. You have also these happiness scales. We have also looked at those. We have life satisfaction. So there's different ways of trying to assess the mental well-being or health of people in that regard. In this particular case, life satisfaction was indeed like how overall would you assess your life. Sometimes it's also compared to your peers, which also gives you a relative measure. But all these different measures more or less gave the same results, interestingly. And this life satisfaction measure is one that's internationally, in psychology, also used a lot. So it's not something, even though you're rightly point that I also think that I would probably ask or say something different at different points of the day or depending on the day of the week potentially. But it is really a validated measure that is used internationally. And that's also why we used it here, because we had migrants and non-migrants. And with a lot of measurement, particularly with life satisfaction, you do also see differences across cultures and the way you report and the way what you report. So in line with that, we use, for example, also a very standardized loneliness measure, which is validated across cultures to make sure that you're measuring something valid for each of the groups. So this is a valid measure, but I do agree with you that there's other measures that we could use. We did so, and we found actually similar findings in that regard. So it doesn't seem to matter that much which one you use. And we're currently, for those of you from Groningen who are probably involved in the Lifelines data, we're using currently also Lifelines data. And there you do have a lot of also not only self-evaluated questions, but also a lot of really physical measured elements of health. So there's not only the self-evaluation or the mental well-being, but also really your physical characteristics. And so we're currently working on that. We just got data released yesterday. So today, Katarina started working on it.
I'll come to you first. Here was a question.
Thank you for the lecture. I had two questions. So the first one was about in the long term. So do the kids that move a lot will move a lot in the future? Maybe you didn't experience it yet with this data set, but what does the literature say? Because I can imagine that if it has negative consequences on them, then they will try, once they form a family, to stop moving that much as when they did when they were kids. I wonder what's your take on that?
Yeah. Very good question also. There is actually quite some research, or we did quite some research on that with some data sets share, where it's elderly people. So we could look at their childhood, but we could also basically follow their whole life course in the meantime. So they're over 55 currently. And what was found there is that if you move in childhood, it's more likely that you move yourself as well in adulthood. So, which is very much in line with a lot of intergenerational transmission of behavior. So you see that a lot of things that you learn during childhood are also passed on by yourself in adulthood. And we found this actually for all European countries. So that's not something that's specific for just the Nordic countries or just the Netherlands. It's really across the board that indeed you transmit mobility. And we did find this also in a different study, not related to this project at all, for international migrations. So if you have moved as a child across borders, you're also more likely to move in adulthood yourself. So we call this a kind of mobility capital, because we often speak as sociologists about social capital, culture capital, and we call this mobility capital. So it seems that indeed, if you have experienced it, you pass it on also in the following generation.
But isn't counterintuitive that even the kids that have bad experience moving in will then move in the future?
Yes, and that's the part we don't know, whether it's the same for everybody, because we can not really distinguish that well at the moment. Because it could very well be that it's particularly the kids who were well off and the ones that were already in a good position, they are moving again in adulthood as well. Whereas those who are probably in this disadvantaged position, they probably do, but we don't have enough data to really differentiate that well and also to distinguish what is happening. But in the future, with the register data, we can do so. Currently, we have to rely on survey data that are incomplete there, where we don't have the information or don't have sufficient respondents to make any reliable analysis on. But indeed, what we assume is that there is really a dichotomy. But in general, for international migration, we do find it, that moving reinforces moving.
Cool.
Yeah?
One moment. Can your question wait a little bit? Yeah? Yeah. Yeah.
Is there maybe also a difference in the answer of the question you not really know, if people have children themselves, because maybe you make other choices when you are alone than when you have children, because you knew how it was when you moved and moved and moved.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know of any study that really has. No, I don't know. I'm sorry, I cannot give you the answer. No.
I'm a little bit curious. Have we moved all? No? Oh, you. That's going to be your question.
Yeah, thank you, Helga, for your presentation. Interesting, and I understand that it is possible to measure the happiness status of a person. But what I really am puzzled by is how the hell are you able to make a connection between the life appreciation of a person and all these diverse histories of migration, which are only part of an individual, of each individual. And you are constrained to use available indicators that you can get from the statistics. And my happiness does not depend only on those indicators that you can find in the statistics. So what does make you confident that the conclusions that finally it is great. Many countries are doing. You have a lot of people who doing this research. But what does give you the confidence that you really can say something new that we do not know already? Everybody knows that many moves in your life is not that easy. But there are a lot of things that are not that easy.
Yeah.
So what gives you the confidence that you come up with real new insights and that you can sustain with academically proven conclusions?
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. Like everything in science, it's moving on in small steps, right? So it's not big steps, it's always trying to find little pieces of the puzzle that bring you further in the questions that we have. And there has been quite some research about all kinds of factors when we stick to life satisfaction, for example, where we know these are important in life satisfaction. So what we try to do is indeed include those elements that we know from previous research are having an effect on people's life satisfaction, or that are having an effect on people's demographic behavior, or that have an effect on other health behaviors. We include those elements because we have hypotheses in line with previous research that they are of importance. What we try to bring in with this research is to what extent does that also relate to the moving in childhood. So for example, we know that divorce has a negative effect on well-being in the short run of children. But we don't know whether it's just the divorce or is it the combination of divorce and moving. And you can very well disentangle those two events because not all children who experience divorce are moving. So in that way, you can try to disentangle different parts of the puzzle. Obviously, it's different little parts. We're not also doing natural sciences, so I can never be 100% sure that everything is causal related X to Y. We're trying to make associations that bring the field further to see which are the different little elements that are really accumulating. And I think what we try to do here is also because we can have different siblings, for example, who experience they all experience the move, but at a different time in their life. So in these ways, they share the same things, they share the same context, and you can see to what extent the age might matter. Again, it's not physics, so it's not X and the Y are totally causal. But you can look at the different relationships that are happening. And so far, the moving part was really underestimated, and if it was studied at all, it was just did you move or not. And what we see here is that there is really just a small group of children, so moving is very common. What we see is a small group of children that are very vulnerable. And I think that is a really asset of this work, to show where vulnerability comes in. Also, at what ages does it come in? It doesn't necessarily affect everybody equally, right? So I think those are the innovative parts that we're bringing in, and not as physics can do with the causal relationships totally, but by bringing in and trying to diversify these little elements that we can see count up to the whole picture. And of course, the measures in the data are just measures. We can all discuss the rest of the evening whether they're accurate or not, but they do give some insight. And if we have so many cases that you can study, you can say something. And there's also other ways to complement these findings now, as I was starting also the lecture, by doing more qualitative research and see how people experience certain things. Because what we find not necessarily reflects also always exactly what people themselves would say is important. But again, that's another different part of the puzzle that should be added in the next step.
I have a very light curiosity question. Earlier you mentioned the German model of co-housing, these Mehrfamilienwohnung, and you probably digged into that a little bit through your research. So I was wondering if you came across really fancy co-housing alternatives in Europe, and which one there was. Yeah, and there's another question linked to that is because you mentioned policy making and how important that is in transforming the way we live together. And I was wondering, what can we, the people, do to make that happen? So, yeah. That's the question.
I'm now speaking a bit more as the vice chair of the state committee than as the PI of this project, but that's no problem. The good examples of housing. I think why I mentioned the Mehrfamilienhäuser is because when we in the Netherlands think about living together and aging, we often see aging as the problem, and we try to put people who are all aging, or people also have their own initiative, to live together. But then you basically age together. And the interesting example of the intergenerational living together housing is that you actually do across generations live together, which has shown to have several benefits in terms of not only care for the elderly, but also care for children, younger people, which also brings communities more together, so you have more to do with each other than when you just, I mean, we seem to be very open in the Netherlands. We open the curtains, but we close the door, right? I mean, that's what a lot of international people also say. You always have to make an appointment beforehand, and we basically just sweep our own street part, and we don't do that of the neighbors, but we open the windows and the curtains. So I think that's exactly the examples what you see internationally, where if you can build also a community with living and not just with generations together, but across generations, that is an example where you, especially in a context of aging societies, that is an important element, because the dividing lines that we as a state committee also noted is also not only educational lines or ethnic lines, but also between generations. Because we more and more have elderly living together, young people together, whereas if you want to make that a coherent whole, then these kind of living arrangements need to change. But the second reason why it also needs to change is that if we need care to the extent that we need with not only the aging population, but also the care for young people because their parents are needed in the labor market, we need to rethink how we organize this. Because otherwise we basically need all people who are entering the labor market to go into the care sector. That means no economic growth, that means no other sectors than care. So we have to reconsider how we live together across generations. We don't necessarily need, that's another discussion. You could also say we don't need it. You can also, but if we say, okay, we want to sustain an economic, we also want to sustain a welfare state where we have benefits and where we can sustain that economically, then you do need some economic activity at some point. But yeah, read the CPB report for that one on labor migration that came out last week.
Is there another question? Okay. My last question, would it be your policy advice to live more together?
Yeah, absolutely. And the second one, and I mentioned that in response to the first, that people get much more the opportunity that they live the way they want to live, to also make this happen and try to change together to make that also happen. We can, via policies, also really abolish certain negative effects of why we don't do this. And I think their policy can come, but we also need ourselves to change our mind about how we actually want to see our future. So it's our choice how we build our future. And I think also the research we're doing here, it's really about children and their future. So it's really something that we can make together. And if we we should not only look at policy. That's actually what I wanted to say. I mean, policy is an important instrument, but it's also part of how we want our society to build for the future.
So it's also our own responsibility.
Excellent.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Helga. Again, a warm applause. And thank you, of course, for coming. And please, you can find our programs on our website, and I hope to see you again.